This podcast includes discussion of rape and sexual assault, abuse, murder, and other criminal behavior. Listener discretion is advised. Christmas Day, 2009, dawned cold and clear at Point of the Mountain. Doug Lovell wasn't able to walk through the fresh snow that blanketed the prison yard. He couldn't make a snowball or sit around a pine tree decked with lights, ornaments, and tinsel, exchanging presents with his loved ones. Instead, Doug sat at his typewriter and pecked out a message.
My name is Doug Lovell. I hope I have reached you all in good health and spirits.
He was writing to a group of missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who were serving in the Marshall Islands. Their mission president, who Doug knew, had asked him to provide the missionaries with an inspiring message.
I thought I would share with you something that has been extremely difficult for me to talk about since the death of my brother.
Doug wrote his brother Royce had been an A student who loved sports. Royce had been an Eagle Scout and an active member of the church. That had changed once Royce developed a drug habit. Doug said he and Royce had been very close.
That all changed the day before he died. To this day, I have no idea what the reason was, but we got into a horrible argument. I thought at any second the punch would come that would silence me. It never did. I don't know why, but he just walked away.
Doug described getting the call at work and rushing home with his brother Russell, only to find Royce dead.
I remember opening the front door and seeing Royce lying on the living room floor.
He went on, writing that in the days and months after Royce's death, he felt regret for never telling his brother he had loved him. He said he had learned when you love someone, you should let them know.
I hope none of you will feel love for someone and risk losing them without ever having said these 3 simple words. I love you.
Nowhere in this letter did Doug acknowledge why he was in prison. He didn't tell the missionaries how his own actions had deprived Joyce Yost of spending that same cold Christmas day with her own children and grandchildren, showering them with the love they deserved.
I wish you all good health and happiness throughout the 2010 year. Take good care and let us all find a way to live and be more Christ-like in our daily lives.
This is Cold, Season 2, Episode 11, Rising Star. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. More after the break. PBS aired a documentary in July of 2007 called Breaking the Curse. It profiled a woman named Becky Douglas. Becky was an Atlanta housewife who, after losing a daughter, began doing charity work combating leprosy in India. Becky had founded a nonprofit called Rising Star Outreach. Doug Lovell saw the documentary. He wrote a letter to Becky, asking if he could contribute to Rising Star. He didn't have much to offer. His only income came from delivering food trays to other inmates.
I earn 40 cents an hour for a grand total of less than $30 a month.
But Doug told Becky he wanted to donate $5 a month to her cause. Becky was touched. She wrote back to Doug. He replied to her response, and they soon became pen pals. Becky didn't know the details of Doug's crime, but found him in his letters to be intelligent, remorseful, and, she thought, even repentant. She noticed his $5 checks, arriving without fail month after month. It seemed to her a significant sacrifice for a man of such limited means.
I'm locked up 21 hours a day. Only during my out-of-cell time can I make phone calls, shower, play games, or go outside. The outside yard is very small, 10 feet by 20 feet by 28 feet high, all concrete.
Becky came to think of Doug as a friend. He even invited her to visit him at the prison, which she did in 2012. They sat and talked separated by glass, for 4 hours. Doug had been raised in a religious household. Both of his parents were, like Becky, devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or as they are more commonly known, Mormons. But Doug hadn't seemed to have much interest in religion himself for much of his life. That had changed in 2003, right around the time his appeal to the Utah Supreme Court over the effort to withdraw his guilty plea was getting underway. That's when Doug started meeting with a Latter-day Saint bishop named John Newton. The church maintained a presence at the prison, and Doug had discovered he was able to leave his cell for extended conversations with Bishop Newton every Sunday.
Whenever I leave my section, I am handcuffed behind my back and my legs are shackled. I'm allowed 1 2-hour visit each weekend. All visits are non-contact. I have not touched a loved one since I received the death penalty.
Bishops in the Mormon tradition are not professional clergy. They have jobs and families and serve on a volunteer basis. The bishops assigned to the prison's death row unit rotated every few years. When John Newton departed in 2005, Doug continued meeting with his replacement, a man named Brent Sharman. Brent was a PhD-level psychologist who had spent his career providing counseling through LDS Family Services, a church-owned nonprofit behavioral health provider. Brent's wife Janet was vice president of student life at Brigham Young University, the church's premier private school. Doug had never finished high school, but the Sharmans pulled strings to get him enrolled in correspondence courses through BYU. That wasn't the only opportunity provided Doug through his new connections. This comes from the news archives of KSL-TV.
Not everyone gets to peruse family documents in foreign archives.
We enable people to make searches for family history.
Enter the LDS Church. It sponsors a nonprofit family history organization called Family Search.
Family Search is a digital genealogical repository,
which boasts the largest collection of family history records in the world.
It includes billions of images of historical documents gathered from around the globe.
Those images are then sent to Salt Lake City, and within a month, the records are published on FamilySearch.org.
But not before the names, dates, and places are transcribed by volunteers, including some Utah State Prison inmates. Doug wasn't eligible to take part in that work because he lived in maximum security, with no access to the computer lab. He petitioned prison staff to make an exception, and after some deliberation, they agreed to let him use a laptop for the genealogy work. The man overseeing the inmate volunteers on behalf of the church at the time was a missionary named Gary Webster. Gary had a long history with the prison. He had first started working there in the late 60s while pursuing his master's degree in social work. In the late 70s, Gary had taken a job with the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. He had been the board's executive secretary in August of '80, at the time of Doug's parole hearing in the armed robbery case. Gary's signature is on the paperwork that allowed Doug to walk free in '82 after he had served just half of the minimum term. Gary had been on the parole board when Ogden hi-fi shop killer Dale Selby Pierre, who I mentioned in episode 9, came up for a clemency hearing ahead of his execution.
Selby almost always avoided eye contact. During his hearing before the Board of Pardons, he stared at the table or the floor when addressing board members. The only time he showed strong emotion during the 2-day hearing was when he described almost daily beatings during his childhood, many for just minor infractions.
Selby, who was black, had found religion in prison. He had connected with a Catholic priest.
Selby, he says, studied the life of St. Augustine, a 4th-century Christian who repented after a life of debauchery.
He had said he was no longer the same man who had killed 3 people in the basement of the hi-fi shop.
This individual will not or is not capable of doing the deeds that I did in 1974.
Gary, who is white, had not been swayed. He had voted in favor of execution. 2 decades later, Gary received a calling from the Church of Jesus Christ to replace Brent Sharman as bishop over Uinta I at the Utah State Prison. He began meeting with Doug Lovell, failing to piece together that they had met before. In their talks, Doug told Gary he hoped to be resentenced to life with the possibility of parole. Even if the parole board never let him out of prison, he would at least be moved from maximum security back into general population. Gary believed Doug exhibited genuine remorse. He was likewise impressed by Doug's philanthropic efforts, which included writing many letters, like this one, to a group of teenage Latter-day Saints.
Before coming to prison, I became a bit of a lost soul. I made horrible choices in my life that have had a deep, negative impact on many lives.
Doug had grown prolific with these epistles.
I had a lot of anger and frustration build up inside of me, and all too often guys like me have a hard time expressing their thoughts and feelings because it's not a guy thing to do. Big mistake.
He often extolled the virtues of therapy, talking about how it had helped him change from the disturbed man he had once been.
Even after 22 years in prison, I still get teary-eyed when I reflect on things I've done.
What those things were, he didn't bother to say.
I hope you will love, respect, and value life and family. Family is an absolute treasure that is all too often misplaced. My mom died in 1991. I was unable to attend her funeral. She and I were always very close, and to this day it still tugs at my heart that I was not there for her.
Gary at one point learned the church had never taken disciplinary action against Doug over the rape or murder of Joyce Yost. He convened a priesthood council, which resulted in Doug's excommunication. Doug was kicked out of the church into which he had been baptized as a child. Doug seemed to take his excommunication in stride, not giving up on his charitable efforts. He even wrote to prison warden Stephen Turley in August of 2011 to propose a partnership between the church and the inmates of Uinta I.
Over the many years, the LDS Church has encouraged members to get involved in service projects. Living in a maximum security building, it has been difficult finding a service project the church would support and one that would not be a security risk to the prison.
Doug said he had come up with one, in which he and other inmates would assemble humanitarian aid kits using materials provided by the church.
This humanitarian service project would not only benefit children around the world, but it would also be of value to us in being able to give back to society and give us a real and needed sense of self-worth.
This proposal went nowhere. The church already operated its own humanitarian aid organization. It informed Doug his offer was appreciated, but not necessary. Doug's proposal for that humanitarian aid kit project just happened to come on the heels of his victory at the Utah Supreme Court, which I detailed in the last episode. The High Court had cleared the way for Doug to formally withdraw his guilty plea to the murder of Joyce Yost.
It's not right what happens to people. You're caught up in this mess and you can't stop it.
That had set the stage for a new trial.
The system has so many, many flaws.
Joyce's children, Kim Salazar and Greg Roberts, through their attorney, pressed the court to make that happen sooner rather than later.
Do it, do it, do it.
Judge Michael Lyon scheduled the trial for February of 2014. But first things first. Doug needed a new attorney. He'd been living on death row for nearly 20 years and had no financial resources to speak of. As a result, the court appointed him a public defender. Defense attorneys in capital cases have to meet certain requirements to make sure defendants accused of death penalty crimes, where their very lives are on the line, have competent and experienced representation. In Utah, this is called Rule 8. Weber County, where Doug was charged, maintained individual contracts with a small number of public defenders. Only a couple were Rule 8 certified. One was named Michael Bowis. Judge Lyon assigned Michael to Doug's case, along with a second attorney named Sean Young. They went to work beginning in August of 2011. Michael visited Doug at the prison and spoke to him several times a month by telephone. They exchanged letters, right up until May of 2012, when Doug stopped responding. Doug soon told Michael he didn't want to work with him any longer, and asked to have another attorney appointed. But Doug also told the court he had a long-standing beef with the only other Rule 8 certified public defender in Weber County at that time. Michael kept working. He filed a motion, at Doug's urging, to have Judge Lyon disqualified from the case. This was due to a few passing comments the judge had made during a hearing back in 2006. Judge Lyon had said Joyce's family deserved closure. Michael Bowis suggested this proved bias on the part of the judge. Another judge reviewed that argument and rejected it. No sooner had that happened than Doug dashed off a letter to Judge Lyon. Here's what he wrote.
During the last few months, the relationship between Mr. Bowis and I has reached a point of complete and utter breakdown in communication and trust. It is quite obvious he and I cannot work together.
Judge Lyon denied Doug's request for a new attorney, and he told Michael to go down to the prison and work things out. Instead, Doug wrote another letter, this time to the Utah Supreme Court.
When I went to court on August 9th to argue against my lead attorney, the courtroom was packed. To say the least, it was an extremely difficult and intimidating experience to stand there handcuffed behind my back in front of all those people and argue not only against my lead attorney, but also to an unsympathetic and clearly biased judge and two prosecutors was very nerve-wracking.
This coming from a person who had in the past sat on the witness stand in open court and described how he had raped, kidnapped, and murdered a woman. Doug told the High Court he just wanted a new attorney, qualified or not. He also revived his argument that Judge Lyon was biased.
3 hearings were held in Judge Lyon's court where it was made clear that Ms. Yost's family wanted nothing but the death penalty for me. 10 years later, during 2 hearings in April of 2006, Judge Lyon made comments that things had been going on long enough and the victim's family needed their closure. Closure for the family could only mean one thing: for me to be put to death.
The final paragraph of this letter seemed almost prophetic.
I bring these issues to the court's attention now in hopes that we are not addressing them 5, 10, 20 years down the road.
In the months that followed, Doug continued sending letters to Judge Lyon, insisting he had fired Michael Bowis.
This court has no right to force Mr. Bowis to represent me. He and I clearly have irreconcilable difference, communication problems, and I do not trust him. To have Mr. Bowis represent me would be no different than having the prosecutor represent me.
Neither Judge Lyon nor the Utah Supreme Court were persuaded. Doug would keep his attorney. The prosecution lost one of its attorneys, though, during the summer of 2013. Bill Daines, who had led the case against Doug for more than 20 years, died as a result of a brain aneurysm. Greg Roberts told me Bill's knowledge of the case had been encyclopedic.
That's what we felt like we lost there with Bill Daines.
And his death, so soon before the trial, shifted a significant burden onto the shoulders of the second prosecuting attorney, Gary Heward. Like Bill, Gary had been on the case since the early 90s.
He was just a young law clerk when this all first started. This was like the first big thing that happened in his career.
I should note, the Weber County Attorney's Office refused to give Gary clearance to interview for this podcast. Gary was headed for retirement, but assured Kim and Greg he would not abandon them.
He'll be there. He he will be there to see this thing through for as long as he possibly can. I have no doubt about that.
Another setback was coming. Judge Lyon retired from the bench of Utah's 2nd District Court in November of 2013. Like prosecutor Gary Heward, Michael Lyon offered to continue on with the case after his retirement due to its complicated history. But the presiding judge decided instead to reassign it. So, the case against Doug Lovell, which had already been handed off once, ended up before a third judge, a man named Michael Derrida. The handoff of the case just months before the scheduled trial caused problems. Judge Derrida acknowledged he needed more time to get up to speed. He pushed the date of the trial back from February to August, then again to March of 2015. So much for the speedy trial Kim Salazar had requested.
We've never gotten anything speedy.
The delays had an impact on Doug's side as well. His father Monin died as a result of pneumonia and heart failure on March 11, 2014. The case continued to grind on as the court dealt with several issues. The first involved money. Capital cases had evolved since '93. Defense attorneys in capital cases had come to rely on forensic psychologists, investigators, and mitigation specialists. Doug's defense team asked the court for permission to hire all three. The psychologist would evaluate Doug to determine if any mental or physiological issues were at play. The mitigation specialist, an expert skilled at digging deep into a person's past, would try to uncover any evidence that might help explain Doug's actions. And the investigator would search for flaws in the police work. Weber County would have to foot the bill for these services since Doug was indigent and balked at the additional expense. Then, there were the pretrial motions. Doug's lawyers filed a flurry of them, the most consequential focusing on Rhonda.
Hi. How you doing? Hanging in there.
The defense sought to keep as much of Rhonda's testimony out of the trial as possible. They attacked her on two fronts. First, they argued conversations she and Doug had shared while married were protected under what's known as spousal privilege. This legal concept says what you tell your spouse in private can't be used against you in court. But of course, there are exceptions. Utah law says spousal privilege doesn't apply when the comments are made in furtherance of a crime. So soliciting your spouse's help to carry out or cover up a murder isn't protected. Spousal privilege also might not apply to anything Doug and Rhonda discussed after they were divorced. Like, say, when Rhonda had visited Doug at the prison while wearing the wire.
I hate Clark.
Rhonda, I do too. This is going to be a battle. It could go several days.
That doesn't mean I have to go every day.
Second, Doug's lawyers argued during those two visits by Rhonda, she had been acting as an agent of the state. They said this had violated Doug's constitutional rights, as he had previously invoked his right to remain silent. Judge Derrida didn't bite. He ruled against the spousal privilege argument in all but one instance, meaning most of Rhonda's testimony would be permitted at the trial. The one comment he refused to allow was one Rhonda had made when describing the night Doug was arrested for DUI while driving toward Joyce's apartment with a loaded handgun. Rhonda had said Doug told her that night, "I am going to kill Joyce." Doug provided his defense team with a list of people he believed might testify on his behalf. They included Becky Douglas, head of the charity Rising Star Outreach, as well as the four bishops who I mentioned earlier. Also on the list were several prison guards and social workers, former inmates, and even the attorney who had helped Doug arrange visitation with his son in the late 90s. The defense's mitigation specialist began working through the list, making initial contact and screening the potential witnesses. Michael Bowis, as lead attorney, assigned Sean Young responsibility for following up with several of them. Meanwhile, Joyce's children Kim Salazar and Greg Roberts told the prosecutors they still wanted the death penalty.
I'm 100% for the death penalty.
But it wasn't really up to them.
We're just dealing with the hand we're dealt.
A sort of loophole allowed Doug a choice. If convicted, he had the option of being sentenced under the current law, which would include possible sentences of life, life without parole, or death. Or he could be sentenced under the law that had been in place at the time of the crime in '85.
Life without the possibility of parole was never on the table. That wasn't even a thing yet.
Going with the old law would be a big gamble. Doug went all in. He chose the old law, meaning the only sentencing options would be life with the chance of parole or death. He did not intend to live the rest of his life in prison.
I don't know, is it worse to just be caged up like an animal for the rest of your life? Or to die for what you've done? To take the hand you were dealt. We didn't ask to be dealt this hand.
Doug also faced another choice, whether to have the judge or the jury decide his sentence. He had gone the judge route in '93 and received death. The jury would have to be unanimous in selecting death, otherwise Doug would get life and a chance of someday securing his freedom. Doug wanted the jury, wagering he would be able to win over at least one juror. If you leave South Ogden, where Joyce Yost once lived, headed south towards Salt Lake City on US Highway 89, you will pass through a small community called Fruit Heights. This place, nestled at the foot of the Wasatch Mountains, was once covered in cherry orchards. Nowadays, many of those orchards have become subdivisions, filling in the town's 2 square miles with single-family homes. But in the early '80s, much of that land was still undeveloped. At the far southern tip of town, along the border with the neighboring city of Farmington, the highway passes an RV campground and water park called Cherry Hill. On the opposite side of that highway sits a frontage road and a narrow strip of undeveloped land covered in thick brush. That's where, on the afternoon of February 5th, 2015, a man walking his dog noticed something out of place. It was white and round, sitting against the base of a tree at the bottom of a hill. The curious dog walker stepped off the sidewalk and into the brush to get a closer look. Then he pulled out his phone and called 911. A Farmington police officer arrived first, followed by a detective and the Davis County Sheriff's Office Forensics Unit. They established a perimeter, stringing yellow crime scene tape around the object. A human skull. News reporters showed up soon afterward. A sheriff's sergeant fielded their questions.
Especially with it being along the hillside, you don't know if an animal could have brought it from a different location. There's so many factors that we're going to try to piece together and find the origin of this skull.
Sunset comes early to Utah in the winter, and daylight was already fading. The investigators brought in a cadaver dog at first light the next morning, but failed to find anything. They next set up search lanes, sort of like lap lanes in a swimming pool, by stretching crime scene tape from the road all the way up the wooded hill. While doing this, one of the officers noticed something sticking out of the ground uphill from where the skull sat. It appeared to be cloth. Tugging at it resulted in something else coming out of the ground. Bone. People living at the top of the hill, on Farmington's Kingston Road, were stunned.
For something to be there for a long period of time seems unlikely, but you can see how...
The detectives located ribs, vertebra, and scraps of clothing in a small depression that appeared to have been a grave, just feet away from the back property line of one of those houses. It was so close that in the summer, the people living there had been unknowingly tossing their lawn clippings onto the gravesite. The detectives sent photos of the bones to a forensic anthropologist who said they were definitely human.
You know, obviously there could have been a body there and could have been there for quite a while and hidden by all the debris, the leaves and stuff.
The bones were modern, not from a pioneer-era grave or an indigenous people's burial site. The detectives began a meticulous scouring of the scene, working along those search lanes.
The detectives and the search party is literally on their hands and knees combing through the debris of the hillside with their hands.
They swept away dead leaves and grass, looking for the tiniest bit of thread or chip of bone. They planted little flags any place they found something.
I was watching them earlier and they're like sticking those little yellow like sprinkler flags in the ground everywhere. And I'm like, why are they all the way up here?
Kara Baldwin watched from her backyard at the top of the hill.
It's like 10 feet away from where the back of the yard starts.
Kara Baldwin has been in her Fruit Heights home for 4 years and lived in the area most her life.
When I was in high school, that used to be a pond before they built the frontage road right there. And kids used to joke that people stashed bodies in that pond, but it was like an urban legend when you're in high school.
Toward the end of the second day, a detective collected the skull from where it still sat at the base of the tree. On the third day, the searchers established a grid over the gravesite. They brought in surveying tools to take precise measurements. They donned Tyvek suits to avoid contaminating the scene and began excavating. They removed no more than an inch of soil at a time, moving the dirt into 5-gallon buckets, which were then sifted. They worked around the exposed bones, digging layer by layer, expanding outward in an effort to find the original cut or wall of the grave. Randy Salazar saw the news reports and drove down to Fruit Heights to observe this work firsthand.
First thing, I always think of Joyce.
The forensics team excavated so far down that the bones and clothing were left standing in what they described as a pedestal of dirt. They undercut the pedestal, allowing the half-buried bones to come loose. They were then able to collect them and take them to the office of the Utah Medical Examiner. The ME faced a difficult task, determining who this person was and how long he or she had been buried on the side of that hill.
It is an opportunity to hopefully find this person and figure out if we can solve a missing case.
Seating a jury for Doug Lovell's capital murder trial proved no small task. The court screened from a pool of 200 potential jurors, seeking just 12. That process was to begin on Monday, March 9th. But Doug's defense team and the Weber County prosecutors signed an agreement on the Friday prior. It said Doug was going to plead guilty. Stop me if you've heard this one before.
How the hell is he so slick that he does that stuff?
The strategy seemed all too familiar to Joyce's family. Greg Roberts had seen prosecutors offer an olive branch to Doug once before, when Doug had promised to lead police to his mother's remains.
But you could tell he wasn't going to, so it just became like our decision was made. Let's just go for the death penalty.
Greg told me that back in '93, no one had warned him a death verdict would tie his family to Doug's case through decades of appeals.
I didn't understand that at the time. Obviously, I fully understand it now.
The nature of the proposed plea deal was a bit different this time around, considering Doug no longer had the bargaining chip of returning Joyce's body. He intended to enter what's known as a conditional guilty plea. He would admit to the crime, but in exchange, would reserve the right to appeal all of Judge Michael Derrida's decisions regarding his pretrial motions. The judge had some concerns about this. The way the rules surrounding conditional guilty pleas were worded made it likely if any appeals court reached a different conclusion than he had on any issue, no matter how minor, Doug would be able to withdraw the plea. Again. It felt to Kim Salazar not like an honest attempt by Doug to come clean, but instead part of a ploy, a delay tactic.
He still shows up in court as smug as he can be and still is more worried about fighting for his own life.
Judge Derrida called the proposed deal, quote, ill-conceived, ill-advised, and ill-timed. He refused to accept it. This put Doug in a strange position. His lawyer, Michael Bowis, did not intend to claim Doug's innocence because the evidence proving Doug had killed Joyce was by that point overwhelming and irrefutable. The defense's entire focus would be the trial's penalty phase, where they would try to show Doug was a changed man who had undergone a religious epiphany and was thus deserving of a chance for parole. They couldn't get to the penalty phase, though, without first going through the guilt phase, where it would be clear to the jury Doug had pleaded not guilty to a crime he didn't actually contest committing. In a court filing, Michael Bowis said the jury was likely to think Doug was playing games, wasting their time. He wanted the jurors informed of the failed plea attempt. Judge Derrida refused this, too. One other little thing I should mention. As the prosecution and defense were vetting potential jurors, Doug informed Michael Bowis not once but twice he found a woman who had been brought in as a prospective juror attractive. He wanted Bowis to pass that message along to the woman. Doug's desire to express physical interest in this context raised serious concerns for the defense, considering he had also told Joyce Yost he had found her attractive before raping her. South Ogden police sent a copy of Joyce Yost's dental records to the office of the Utah Medical Examiner in the days following the discovery of that shallow grave on a hillside along U.S. Highway 89. They weren't alone.
Investigators all over the state were scrambling to check their old case files and their evidence rooms for anything that may help identify these bones that were found in Fruit Heights.
That's Adam Asoro, Assistant Police Chief for the city of Woods Cross, a suburb just north of Salt Lake City. He was, at the time, a detective assigned to a missing persons cold case from 1983.
Every detective that has a cold case is really hoping that any remains will be their missing person.
The Davis County Sheriff's Office scheduled a press conference as jury selection continued in Doug Lovell's murder trial.
And today, detectives announced that they identified those human remains found along Highway 89 in Fruit Heights. Mike Anderson joined us live tonight with more. Mike?
Randy Salazar called his daughters and told them to go sit with their mother, Kim, just in case word came that the bones belonged to Joyce.
I know she wants closure one day, and I pray to God that her and Greg get that one day.
This was not that day. The bones excavated from that hillside belonged not to Joyce, but instead to a young woman named Theresa Rose Greaves. The dental records Woods Cross detective Adam Asoro had provided matched.
It's not just one match, it's multiple teeth in multiple areas, so we were pretty confident that Theresa had been found.
It's been 6 years now since the discovery of Theresa's remains. At the time I'm recording this in 2021, her case remains an unsolved homicide.
She needs people to speak for her, especially now, and I think that's what we're trying to do.
So let's pause from Joyce's story for a moment to talk about Theresa Greaves. Theresa grew up in Camden County, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. Her mom wasn't in the picture long, so Theresa lived with her grandmother during her early years. As a teen, Theresa attended Collingswood High School. Theresa's life, and the lives of her high school friends, had seemed to revolve around music.
They were big into music back then.
They loved the Oak Ridge Boys, and perhaps most of all,
they loved the Osmonds.
For the uninitiated, the Osmonds were like Utah's version of the Jackson 5. The Osmonds had started out as a quartet composed of young brothers Alan, Wayne, Merrill, and Jay, who sang barbershop. They'd had their big break in the early 60s on the Andy Williams Show, a variety show broadcast on NBC. The group had soon grown to include another brother, teen heartthrob Donnie.
We're saying bye-bye blue.
By the early 70s, the Osmonds had expanded beyond barbershop into rock and pop. Their popularity skyrocketed, so much so that they even briefly had their own Saturday morning cartoon. By the late 70s, Donnie Osmond and his sister Marie were each on the verge of launching their own solo careers. Theresa, like so many other teen girls of the time, had a huge crush on Donnie.
She shared a lot of correspondence with a lot of other fans, and it was quite obvious that she was a big fan.
Theresa graduated high school in '77, and around that time met a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
That, along with her interest in the music, the Osmonds, is ultimately why she chose to come to Utah.
A couple of Theresa's classmates made the move from Jersey to Utah with her. From there, the trail grows a bit murky.
It's become difficult to pin down exactly where she was and when.
One of Theresa's friends took a job at the Utah Schools for the Deaf and Blind in Ogden in 1981. Theresa followed that friend to Ogden and possibly spent time working at the school herself.
She briefly attended Weber State University, lived at some of the dorms across the street from campus.
I can tell you Theresa briefly lived with one of those friends in American Fork, about 30 miles south of Salt Lake City. She got a job as a housekeeper at a motel in the nearby city of Provo. Theresa considered herself an amateur photographer. She was known to park outside the home of the Osmonds, hoping to snap photos of the famous brothers. She often attended concerts for the bands she loved, where she met and mingled with other fans.
We were able to obtain quite a few letters that she had written, strangers, really. I mean, these are people that she'd never met in person that were also Osmond fans.
Howdy. Received your letter the other day. Thanks for writing. Like the ad in the newsletter said, I answer all. The more the merrier.
Those are Theresa's own words, though not her actual voice, taken from one of her letters, written just weeks before she disappeared. The letter has never been made public before now.
I'm originally from New Jersey, a little town called Woodland. It's outside of Camden and Collingswood. I moved out here just about 3 years ago and like here a lot.
When someone would write her a letter, she would take the time to write them back and often kept correspondence with people for months.
I've been an Oak fan for 4 years. Richard has been my favorite always, too. It was his bass voice that attracted me to the Oaks.
Theresa often signed her letters, Sailing Away, Risa.
You know, back then she liked to use the nickname Risa, R-E-S-A, for Theresa Greaves.
As you know, my name is Theresa. Friends call me Risa, so feel free to do so. And that I'm 23 years old. I'll be 24 on October 1st.
Life wasn't just freewheeling fun for Theresa in Utah.
As I'm sure you know from the address on the envelope, I moved up here to Woods Cross the 1st of June. I needed a change, but miss American Fork. I'm unemployed, but hope it won't be that way much longer.
Her Ford Mustang had broken down not long after the move to Utah, leaving Theresa without her own car. She struggled to set down roots and find steady work.
Ended up renting a bedroom in a trailer home in Woods Cross in 1983, and she'd only lived in our city approximately 2 months before she went missing.
On the morning of Friday, August 5th, 1983, Theresa walked from the trailer home to the post office to get her mail from her P.O. box. She stopped by the bank and deposited $98, all of her money save $12, and then returned home. She called her grandmother back in New Jersey, saying she planned to take a bus into downtown Salt Lake City. It's not clear if Theresa ever made it to the bus. Her family and friends never heard from her again. Theresa's roommate, who had only known her a few weeks, reported her missing to Woods Cross police a couple of days later. Officers started a search but soon hit a dead end. They then turned to the media.
We suspect possible foul play because she's been gone with no contact with any known source. She has left all her personal belongings at the trailer. She has withdrawn no money from a bank account. She was on unemployment but has not collected her checks since she's been missing, and her post office box has not been touched.
Theresa's grandmother back in New Jersey provided police with her dental records, never imagining they would come in handy more than 30 years later. But by the time of Theresa's recovery in 2015, all of her immediate family members were likewise deceased. The investigators couldn't find a single close relative left alive to inform.
There's a lot of details that we have to do a lot of research on. So we are treating this with a lot of sensitivity. We are treating this as a homicide, and we are following every lead with a lot of passion so that we can find exactly what happened to Theresa on that hillside.
The discovery of Theresa's remains breathed new life into her cold case. But even with all that fresh effort and publicity, police are still not sure who killed her or why.
We know that somebody out there caused her harm, and it's our job to identify who that person is and make them face the consequences of what they've done.
They are still trying to find anyone who had contact with Theresa back in the early 80s, either at a church meeting, at a concert, at the Utah Schools for the Deaf and Blind, or even in an Osmonds fan club.
Please look through your old letters. It might be something very small that could help us in this case.
They are also trying to find an important missing piece of the puzzle. Theresa's 1977 Collingswood High School class ring. It was missing from her bedroom in 1983 and was not with her remains in 2015. Doug Lovell was at one point a person of interest in Theresa's case, a fact made plain by the discovery of her remains on that hillside.
Where this starts to get even more interesting is police initially questioned Douglas Lovell about Greaves' disappearance, and he was already facing charges for the rape and murder of another woman, Joyce Yost. He denied ever meeting Greaves at the time.
I don't believe that questioning of Doug ever actually happened. And as far as I know, police have not ruled him out. But neither is he the focus of their investigation, nor do they have specific evidence tying him to Theresa. Doug Lovell's trial began on Monday, March 16, 2015. After opening statements, the prosecution started questioning its witnesses. Kim Salazar went first, followed by her brother Greg Roberts.
I was really impressed with those Weber County prosecutors. There was some carryover from the initial, and there were some people that were new to it, but they were so thorough and they nailed it down so well.
Then retired Clearfield Police Detective Bill Holthouse took the stand.
And then we went through the entire rape thing again. And right front to back, all the way through the whole thing. They were setting the scene is what they were doing.
Doug's defense attorneys, Michael Bowis and Sean Young, declined to cross-examine all but one of the state's witnesses.
He never asked me a question. I was never asked a question.
A woman then read Joyce's testimony from the 1985 preliminary hearing.
He pulled in the stall next to me. He wanted to have a drink. I didn't want to go have a drink. I says, I don't know you. I said, who are you anyway?
Just as Marilee Gren had done at the rape trial 30 years earlier.
He really tried to convince me what a nice person he was, that normally he gives girls flowers, doesn't do things like this.
The final witness for the first day was Kim's ex-husband, Randy Salazar. He looked across the courtroom at Doug.
I would say for 10 years, that man never aged.
And saw for the first time a man with thinning and graying hair. Doug wore a suit jacket and a collared shirt, but no tie. He had shaved his signature mustache. Randy testified about the encounter at the courthouse following Doug's conviction in '85.
He took a few steps, like 3 or 4 steps, stopped and looked at me and said, "She's gone, buddy. She's gone. You'll never see her again."
I can tell you that memory still brings tears to Randy's eyes.
Exactly what he said that day, too. When he said, "You'll never find her. You'll never find her." I wasn't lying. We've never found her.
Randy told me testifying took a huge emotional toll.
That really brought back some real bad memories.
Not just for himself. Kim and Randy's children had been young when their grandmother Joyce had disappeared. Their daughters Melanie and Melissa, now grown, told their parents they wanted to attend the trial.
And Kim told them, and I told them before they went, you might not want to hear what you're going to hear, what you want to hear in there. And you're going to be in the same room as this man for a long time.
You've got a situation where you've got people hearing it as adults for the first time.
They heard stuff in that trial that that Kim had never told them.
In a much different light than they heard it all their lives growing up, for sure.
Day 2 of the trial brought testimony from South Ogden's investigators, including retired detectives Brad Birch and Terry Carpenter. Rhonda Butters also testified. Kim and Randy's children were shocked by Rhonda's story.
They're hearing it raw in a courtroom. It wasn't censored. It wasn't filtered.
I remember them calling me up after one day of the trial and just crying and saying, "Dad, Mom went through hell." I said, Yep, your mom and Uncle Greg went through hell. I said, "And your mom's a very strong person. You have to give her a lot of credit because, Greg wasn't here."
You also went through hell.
I did. It was hard on our marriage.
This experience was like tearing off a 30-year-old scab to find the wound underneath still raw to the touch. There were 2 other witnesses on the state's list, Tom Peters and Doug Lovell. Tom had died in 2007, and Doug obviously wasn't going to testify for the state. But both men had testified during the original '93 sentencing. The prosecutors used proxies to read those transcripts. Joyce's family had to listen to Doug's account of the murder all over again.
I remember all that stuff, and I remember all the stuff he told Kim and Greg, and how he did it. And then you're right here now, asking for another trial, and to get off with this thing.
Prosecutor Gary Heward rested his case at the end of day 2, having put forward a concise but comprehensive presentation.
The evidence that you've heard over the past 2 days amounts to a mountain.
a mountain of evidence.
The defense declined to call a single witness. Doug told the court he would not testify in his own defense. Michael Bowis made no illusion of claiming Doug's innocence during his closing statement.
The details of this case are horrible. There is no denying that. What Doug Lovell did in 1985 was absolutely horrible. There's no excuse for it.
The jury began deliberations the next morning. It took them just over an hour to return their verdict. Doug stood as Judge Michael Derrida began to read. We, the jury,
Do hereby unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Douglas A. Lovell is guilty of murder in the first degree, a capital felony.
Under Utah law, there are specific qualifiers that set capital murder apart from the crime of homicide. In Doug's case, the prosecution had put forward several. They had claimed the murder had happened while Doug was also in the act of committing kidnapping and burglary. They had said he had killed Joyce to prevent her from testifying, to keep her from providing evidence, as retaliation against her, and to disrupt the enforcement of laws. Only one of those qualifiers was necessary to elevate the crime to a capital offense. The jurors, by unanimous vote, said all of those qualifiers applied. Doug's guilt, which hadn't been in dispute, was reestablished, which left the real question still to be decided. Should he die for it? If you or someone you know has endured rape, sexual assault, or sexual abuse of any kind, help is available. In the United States, you can call 1-800-656-HOPE or visit rainn.org to connect with free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. No one need suffer in silence. You are not alone. If you haven't already, please subscribe to or follow Cold to make sure you get every episode. You can also interact with me and the Cold team on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Cold Podcast. Cold is researched and written by Dave Cawley, with editorial oversight by executive producer Cheryl Worsley. Additional executive producers include Paul Anderson, Nick Piniella, and Andrew Greenwood. Audio production by Nina Ernest. Mixing by Trent Sell. Michael Bonmiller composed the main score. Special thanks to the team at Amazon Music. Full credits for each episode are available at thecoldpodcast.com. Cold is an Amazon original by KSL Podcasts in association with Workhouse Media. Thank you for listening.